Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this show, and it's a pleasure to introduce Julia Griffin. She is going to be talking with me about broadband today. Julia Griffin and I go back a long way. We were at this broadband thing over 10 years ago. And she has been a driving force behind the expansion of broadband in the area. In fact, in a recent publication, Next Century Cities describes her as a town manager determined to connect every resident. And that's one of the many things she is. Not the only one, but that's one of the many things she is. Welcome, Julia.
Beatriz, thank you so much. It's great to be here with you. And it's ironic that we're still talking about broadband 10 years later, but we both know it's been a slog.
It really has been a slog. I was thinking the other day about way back when we started, and one of the first things that I remember was the map, because every year, the utilities and the PUC, different agencies, would come to the Science, Technology and Energy Committee, and they would give us those presentations about the state of broadband. And they would bring that big map, and in the map, it looked like things were pretty good. Fairpoint was claiming that they had covered 85%, and within the next year, they were going to be in 95%, and 2 years later, 100%. And that happened every year. The only problem is that the map was completely delusional. It had nothing to do with reality. So every year we looked at that map and we said, where do they get that from? And obviously they got it from the fact that the utilities and the providers were defining as covered areas that were really not covered at all. Not in terms of using, a workable internet for any real purpose, maybe for email, but that was about as far as it got. So that's the reality that we found. The map was delusional. The reality was different. Now, how was the reality different? You dealt with it, from the trenches, from the beginning. So what was the reality like?
So often the maps would show, for example, Lyme had service because 10 people in Lyme Village had service. That didn't mean the whole town of Lyme had high-speed internet service. Likewise for Hanover. Towns and cities all over western, southwestern, and northern New Hampshire were displayed on the map as being served. But time and time again, we would hear stories from our residents about their lack of service. And we knew for a fact that only a small portion of our communities really has robust service. So what is on the map is misleading. It's not accurate. And quite frankly, it's always amazing to me, Beatriz, that the extent to which the telecom providers aren't even prepared to show everybody where they currently provide service. They will tell you that's private information and not subject to sharing with the public. So the Fairpoint's now consolidated. The Comcast, the internet service providers refuse to share their maps with the state and with localities.
Which was really, it was obvious in those meetings we had in Science, Technology and Energy, but it was pretty outrageous because the fact is that those maps always had those shady areas and those gaps, and the gaps could not be completed because the information was not available. Right. So that was a real problem. In addition to that, the areas that they claimed as completed, that is the areas where people did have access, in many cases were just having DSL, which was very slow, very slow up and down. And also it traveled on copper wires, which made it even more unreliable. So it really did not work. Right now, we could not rely on that kind of service, for instance, to have the conversation we are having. There is no way that you can work that out. Right. So, but we have the state not really giving us a clear picture of what the situation was. And then we have the providers, the telecoms. What were the real obstacles when I think that we should clarify what the obstacles were. Why is it that we couldn't get past the telecoms and the utilities and really push that broadband forward? What were the obstacles?
Fundamentally, for the private telecommunications firms, the cost of build out, particularly to rural parts of the state where you've got long runs that are required to serve a fairly small number of customers, that's an expensive build. I mean, the average cost per mile is anywhere from $45,000 to $65,000 per mile. And from the telecom provider's perspective, unless you have a minimum of in Comcast's definition, 20 households per mile, it's not profitable for them to extend service. The same is true for consolidated. And so consequently, the telecommunications companies don't have the incentive to provide service to rural New Hampshire because it's a cost of doing business that's too high. The return on investment is insufficient. And therefore, the obstacle is there's a lack of federal and state funding, and an issue that you and I worked on the entire time you were in the House, and I feel like I've been working on it half my professional life in New Hampshire, has been municipalities cannot issue bonds to invest in the rollout of high-speed internet. We're not authorized by statute, and in spite of attempts year after year after year before the House and the Senate to get a bill through that would allow us to bond for broadband to help reduce the cost to homeowners, either the legislature and or the governor would end up thumbs down on those bills because telecommunications firms said, look, it's not fair for municipalities to wade into this arena. They have an unfair advantage because they have access to lower rates of interest for municipal bonding. We got this covered. Don't worry. But in point of fact, they haven't rolled out service to all these rural areas that are desperate for connections, which is just becoming more and more important as our world becomes more dependent on robust internet to work, to recreate, to study. It's really a critical now utility.
Yeah, because there were several things coming together. First of all, the high cost of any broadband expansion was a reality,
right.
And then when it came to who was going to pick up that high cost, the utilities didn't want anybody in the picture because they actually enjoyed a virtual monopoly in the state. They didn't want any competition. And the problem is that those providers did not operate for the common good. They operated on profit. And there is no way that you can expand broadband to every citizen in the state if you are being guided by profit. Right. Because you can cover areas where the installation eventually is going to give you good returns. And then you can cover areas where the cost is never going to be really offset by the amount of revenue that you get from the residents. So that was a real issue. And then the problem that the providers were allowed to claim again and again, no, but we've got this covered. I remember Fairpond, which is now consolidated. I remember the whole state by the promise and the reckoning should have been entirely covered with high-speed internet like 7 years ago, and of course it hasn't happened. So all those things were real factors, but the municipal thing was a big one, and that's where I did most of the work, because I realized with your help, because you were in the municipal front, I realized that what we absolutely needed was to give the municipalities the ability to bond. And then you ended up with a very different model, because then you had the municipalities bonding to build broadband infrastructure, owning that infrastructure and then leasing it to different providers. And that had the effect of, first of all, the infrastructure was controlled by the municipality, and second, it created competition among providers. Right. And of course, that's something that none of the providers wanted to hear about at that time, and that's why we bumped, again and again into the refusal on the part of the providers, the lack of support by our colleagues sometimes in the Senate or the last time we got the bill through the House with a very good margin. And I thought after this time, it's going to work. And then we got to the Senate, and I saw all the lobbyists from the big telecoms sitting in the first line. And I said, this is not looking good. And eventually the Senate voted it down. Yeah. But this is something that we can still do. And that's one of the things that I'm planning to work on when I get to the Senate. In spite of all those difficulties, there were a number of attempts to do that. And you were, one of the driving forces behind the New Hampshire Fast Roads project. And maybe you could talk about that, because that way everybody would get a sense of how it worked out or didn't, and how all those constraints we'll be talking about played out in the field once you actually tried to implement that expansion program.
Yeah, but talk about, I mean, it was such a wonderful opportunity, and we squandered that opportunity in New Hampshire, Beatriz. So a group of us in Western and Southwestern New Hampshire were able to convince University of New Hampshire to let us piggyback on a grant application they submitted during the last big round of stimulus funds that came out of the Obama administration after the last big recession. UNH wanted to connect all of its campuses around the state. They rolled Dartmouth into that program as well, and wanted to build a high-speed internet fiber backbone to connect all of the campuses of the state of New Hampshire system in Dartmouth. We asked if we could piggyback on the construction of that fiber backbone to extend the backbone from Orford all the way down to Rindge, to pick up areas of Western and Southwestern New Hampshire that were un or underserved. It took a lot of wheedling and cajoling to finally convince UNH to let us join in their application. And we were successful in getting our project funded, which we named New Hampshire Fast Roads. I served on that board for 6 years. We got the funding to build the backbone from Orford through Keene, all the way down Route 10 and into Rindge, with last mile projects in Enfield and Rindge to connect homes in those two towns, because they met the criteria in the application requirements. And the backbone was constructed. And what was really critical for the next phase of the project for Fast Roads was to get the legislature and the governor to authorize the ability for municipalities to bond for broadband, so we could build off that backbone to do last mile build out of open access fiber in all of those communities on the backbone route. And our notion of open access was, we just want to build the roadway because we as municipalities are used to building infrastructure that provides service, and then lease that broadband, that fiber, to any number of users who would like to provide services over the backbone. We couldn't get the legislature and the governor, the combination, to approve the ability to bond for broadband. And that essentially prevented the project from being able to go forward. So we then had to sell the fiber back to the entity that had constructed it, a company called Waveguide. And no sooner did we do that, with their interest in providing last mile service as a private company, then the very next day, they sold their entire company to First Light, a big internet service provider, and closed their doors. So we went from a competitive model with federally funded broadband deployment to right back into monopoly ownership by one large internet service provider that has no interest in providing residential service. What a waste of a federal project, and what a squandered opportunity for this state. Western and Southwestern New Hampshire had an amazing opportunity, and we squandered it.
But you know, it's also a case where there are a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of how do we move forward now and what we can do. And in looking at that case, basically what you instead of building, down to the last mile, you build, a backbone to nowhere, because you couldn't connect it, you couldn't finalize the project, and you couldn't, even though you had the federal money, and even though you had some state money, what was critical was to get the ability for municipalities to bond and to finance that last mile. And without that, it just couldn't happen. So in thinking about right now, we have the same need, we have a pressing need. And what options are we looking at? How do you see it? How do you see us now solving the problems that we've had for so many years, that have just been very much aggravated by COVID-19, and a much more urgent need for a working broadband connection for everyone? And how do we avoid the pitfalls we had then? What can we leverage to make this happen now?
So I'm not sure we've had an opportunity quite like we've got right now, given the groundswell the hue and cry from rural America for higher speed internet service, even internet service at all, given the fact that so many people are now trying to work and school from home. Um, and it seems to me that the only way this is going to happen, Beatrice, is if there is enough sort of anger and frustration out there in rural America demanding equality of broadband service to pile on a federal administration. My hope is we have a change in administration in November. We need a sort of forward-looking administration that doesn't delegate this job to the private sector, because the private sector will not get it done because it's not profitable. It's going to need to be matched with what I would imagine to be a large federal stimulus package. I mean, really big. This is a massive utility scale initiative that the federal government's going to have to commit to undertake in partnership with states. So New Hampshire is going to have to step up and appropriate a hefty amount of money that can be used to match local bonding for broadband investment. It's going to require 3 levels of governmental support in a big way, and people have to demand it, because I don't know that it's up to a Republican or a Democratic administration. It doesn't matter. Folks have got to get together to make this happen, because this has become as critical, if not more critical, than electricity service, and certainly more critical than POTS, plain old telephone service, all that wire on the poles, which more and more people are cutting off their landlines and going to cellular.
You see, the thing is that back in 2008 to 2014, it was very much a partisan issue. It was very much, it was a Democratic issue, it was a Democratic goal, and it was not shared by the Republicans. The view then from the Republicans in the House and the Senate was, it's internet. High-speed internet is not a right, as they would used to say. Broadband is not a right. It's a luxury. I mean, what do people need a broadband for? They need to stream more videos, to watch whatever. So it was a completely inaccurate view. And you could tell them, this is not about watching videos. It's about economic growth, social growth, economic development, education, telemedicine. It just wasn't sinking in. But that's why I keep saying that this situation we find ourselves in is a disaster, but it's also a great opportunity.
It is.
Because I think that now people are going to feel daily, hourly, the lack of that basic tool to continue with normal lives, to develop their communities, to grow their economies. And I think that there is going to be, a much bigger support, and it's going to become less partisan, because what is at stake really is the economy. Let's start right there. I mean, there can be no economic recovery unless we have a really robust broadband access for everyone. And, it's a little bit what happened with the Rural Electrification Act. I was thinking about the origin of the New Hampshire co-op, the electrical co-op. And that's basically what happened. At that point, it wasn't broadband, it was not the telecoms, it was the electrical companies. And the electrical companies were happy to lay wire and poles and so on, in the valleys, in the easy areas where there were lots of people concentrated, but they didn't want to go up the hills. They didn't want to go, that they were not interested in. And the way it happened was that, a bunch of farmers in New Hampshire got together and then got organized. They applied for federal funds, they leveraged state money, and they contribute whatever, and they build the electrical network. So it's going to require that kind of effort, I think.
Right. Very much grassroots.
I know it has to be, but it's not something that can be solved at the community level. Communities cannot take on that burden. The federal money has to be there, the state money has to be there, and the commitment. And then the municipalities can step in, and in stepping in, they retain control of their backbone, which is not a small thing, because that is the best protection against a monopoly by providers of the service. So it's a model that should work. But right now, what models do you see operating within our area that are different but working? I mean, in Lyme now we are getting, and you can. I'll let you tell them about Lyme so that they're going to say I'm biased. So you tell them about Lyme, because
we're all so envious. I've got to credit EC Fiber, first of all, our colleagues across the river in Vermont. Vermont has done a really great job of rural deployment of broadband, in part because the state is very much behind it and throwing money and staff behind it. And our little pull themselves by the bootstraps EC Fiber across the river has steadily marched out and extended fiber all over 34 communities just west of us. They're now standing at the border in East Thetford, and a group of investors in Lyme, because Lyme can't bond for broadband, a group of private investors, philanthropists said, you know what, we live here, we need this, we're going to make this happen. So they're Lyme's bonding for broadband team. They just happen to be philanthropists who are paying for the build out, connecting to the EC Fiber network on the Vermont side of the Connecticut River. To connect all of Lyme. And Carol Monroe, who was the executive director of New Hampshire Fast Roads, when we realized that was not going to fly, went across to take over running EC Fiber for Stan Williams, deploying fiber in their communities. And now she's retired from EC Fiber, but is consulting to the Lyme Fiber Project. And all of our residents in Northern Hanover are standing by the sideline going, please think about coming just south of the border to Rennie Road, to Upper Hanover Center Road, to Dairy Lane, to 3 Mile Road, to Rudsboro Road. Can you extend down into Lebanon? It's truly a grassroots effort. We're so, Limeys have to be so grateful that you have these philanthropists who are willing to do it. But to me, it's a sad state of affairs that we've had to rely on the philanthropy of some generous local residents to make this happen, because New Hampshire's standing in the way of enabling it to happen in a sort of a municipal utility way. So all I can say is that since the pandemic, as soon as the schools closed, I turned to my staff and I said, hold on to your shoes, because we're going to start getting emails about the lack of high-speed internet. My email box is constantly filled with people who are frustrated. They're angry. They need my help. They're pleading. They don't understand why we haven't done this for them. We should be ashamed of ourselves. It's really hard to take it, because I can't tell you how hard we've worked, and it's been like hitting our heads against a brick wall.
I know. I mean, we've certainly been trying for a long time, but the case of Lyme is I mean, it's like a fairy tale in a way. How did that happen?
Right.
But it underscores the basic approach. In this case, we've been extremely lucky because we have that group of very generous philanthropists who've said, you know what, we're going to make this happen. Right. Not all communities have that, and that's why we still have to push hard for municipal bonding as an option, because what becomes clear is that the community has to leverage some money in one way or another. And if you don't have the philanthropist, then the municipality has to have the tools to make that happen. And the municipality can easily have the tools to make that happen. And to me, that's a top priority from the Senate. It was a top priority from the House. But remember this, the last time I did it, my bill got stopped at the Senate.
Yeah.
But I said to myself, this time I will be in the Senate.
Yeah.
So maybe I can do something different. Yeah.
And, my assumption is that, at the municipal level, we're always outgunned by the telecom lobbyists. They are full-time lobbyists. They're well paid. They are down there 24/7. Telecoms make campaign contributions. They have a lock on many legislators. And it's as a municipal official who can't afford to live in the State House and bend people's, ears, it's really tough to compete with the large professional lobbying firms and all the money the telecoms throw at preventing us from wading into their turf. But it's going to be critical that we be allowed to do this, Beatriz. Hanover would bond for broadband in a New York minute if we could do it. It's a no-brainer, and I think you'd see communities all up and down your district, up and down the Connecticut River Valley and southwestern New Hampshire, Cheshire County, Sullivan County. They're desperate. It's just not fair. And unfortunately, Concord, Manchester, Nashua, the Seacoast, those folks don't have a clue what we're dealing with out here because they've got plenty of service. They're densely populated. They don't have to worry about high-speed internet.
I know, but I mean, this district this district is simply not covered in the vast majority of the territory. That is a fact. But the whole of the telecoms on what has been happening is a major issue. And yes, I do remember that last session with the Senate when all of a sudden I realized that we had actually lost the bill before there was a vote. I said, oh, now I understand it. And I said to myself, now I know how to do it. And that's the way I felt. And I can tell you that, when I go into the Senate, my first bill is going to have to do with broadband. And with trying to create that mechanism that would allow not just communities which, like Lyme, have been fortunate to have a group of residents get together and say, we're going to make this happen, but every single community, because not every community has that. And I want to make sure that from Lyme to Charlestown, everybody has access to high-speed internet. It's absolutely crucial. I mean, we're talking about the economy. How are those communities going to recover if they don't have broadband infrastructure? Whether you're talking about Claremont or whether you're talking about Claremont is working really hard at revitalizing the downtown area. They want to incentivize investments in Concord. They want to, attract people so that the economy thrives the way it has thrived in other periods of history. They're not going to be able to do it unless they have broadband. So that's how important it has become. It's not just a communications issue. It's a big economic recovery issue. And that's why I think that it has to be, number one. Well, we've been talking for a long time, and maybe we want to take some questions, unless you want to add something to unless you can think of another approach or another model to broadband expansion right now that we haven't touched on.
I think there's a role for some of our large institutions to get involved in funding. This has always been the challenge for me. So many of our larger employers are struggling to recruit staff because trying to find housing they can afford with high-speed internet is challenging. And so is there a role for some of our larger employers in helping to fund this kind of infrastructure as an employee recruitment and retention tool? Whether it's Dartmouth and Dartmouth Hitchcock, whether it's Hypertherm in this region, whether it's some of the larger businesses in Claremont, I do think there's a potential role there. And to me, it's somewhat of an untapped area that is just another element that I'm seeing is a funding source in other parts of the country where you've seen really good rural broadband deployment.
I think that I actually think that's a very good point. I think that it's something that can be brought into the picture right now because everybody, including those businesses, are going to have more of a stake than they've had before. So I think that when we're talking about leveraging, resources, this is an area that should come forward and help. Philanthropists are great, municipalities are great. What else do we have that we can appeal to, that we can bring into the project and the push for broadband expansion? And I think you just made a very good point. Yeah. So should we go to the questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we had a couple people email in questions in advance, and this question in particular came up from several different people. So we thought we would just ask it broadly since it seems to affect widely the communities. And that question is that I live in a rural area and it's impossible to attain high-speed internet without racking up extravagant costs of $20,000 to $30,000. What can be done to lower these costs?
So this is the fundamental problem with rural deployment of high-speed internet. And this is why the telecoms have not extended service, because the cost to connect a fairly sparsely populated area with high-speed internet is high. The average cost per mile in New Hampshire, with all of the pole attachment and make-ready work that has to happen on the poles to enable the attachment of fiber, the average cost is $45,000 to $65,000 per mile. So for somebody who lives half a mile down a rural back road, they're going to get a cost estimate of $30,000 to connect them with high-speed internet, and that's obviously really onerous for many people to pay that. This is why I'm absolutely convinced that in rural United States, not just New Hampshire, until you get federal and state and local investment in deployment, basically a recognition that we have to build that infrastructure for our citizens, because otherwise the cost to connect is prohibitive. It's not going to happen. And the question that we just had posed to us, which is sort of an amalgam of several questions, all posed by individuals who are facing the very same cost estimates, that's a very real issue that's not going to be solved short of governmental investment, because the private companies aren't going to incur that expense without covering their costs and making a profit.
That's right. And the thing is that that lack of broadband access has a ripple effect, because if you live in an area, the area doesn't have coverage, people are not going to want to move into that area. It's going to be difficult to get people to settle there, and it's going to be difficult to grow the economy locally if people don't want to come. On the other hand, let's imagine that someone does put up that amount of money for fiber to go to that $30,000. The question is, well, what if I do that and then I sell my house tomorrow? How am I going to recover my investment? And it's not clear. And that's a major issue, because you're talking about people who already have mortgages. You're talking about people who have to incur debt in order to finance those $30,000. And let's suppose that all of a sudden they decide to move. They're left holding a huge debt package. So all those things stand in the way of people saying, okay, I'm going to do it. I can do it. I can borrow the money.
All right. Thank you.
All right, we got another question. This one is coming from our live chat. And the question is, what about the money Sununu earmarked for improving internet speed? With COVID, now is the time to strike the fire.
So that was $50 million, Matthew, that Governor Sununu allocated for broadband deployment. I would argue that that's a complete drop in the bucket. $50 million isn't going to get you much broadband extension. And the requirements of the grant are fairly limited in terms of the areas that can make use of those grant funds to submit applications. The projects had to be shovel ready, and they have to be constructed by the end of December, which in the world of broadband deployment, it's virtually impossible to get a project done inside of 18 months because of all the work that needs to be done to prepare poles for attachment of the fiber coaxial cable or DSL. So I know that the Sununu administration is working hard to try and get the federal government to loosen the requirements that the money be expended by the end of December. I think a lot of communities looked at the grant and said, wow, one, we don't have a shovel-ready project. Two, there's no way we can take the responsibility for delivering this project by the end of December with a telecom provider. We can't use it. So about the only entities, as far as I know, that were able to make use of those grant funds were the large internet service providers like First Light that already own dark fiber on the poles and basically want to take grant funds to extend service to areas that are underserved. What I don't know is who ended up getting that money and where the projects are taking place. I know that our particular region didn't qualify because we were above the income levels that were established in the grant. So it's a great idea, but you need a whole lot more money from the state. One, two, you need a whole lot more time to get the projects done. And three, you need the projects not to have to be shovel ready, because those projects take a long time to make happen. 18 to 24 months minimum.
So it's interesting because you hear, well, $40 million from the CARE Act to pay for broadband. That's what Sununu announced. And then I think he said 10 or 16 more million. And it looks like, whoa, now we're going to really get this done. Well, no, it really is a drop in the bucket. It's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for all the reasons you said. Because, the money is not enough, and because there is no way that the timetable is going to work, and that they can't come up with a project that can be implemented in that amount of time. So it's not going to do it. Basically, in answer to the question, it's not going to do it.
Yeah, just to give you an example, Beatriz, to just do Hanover alone is $7.5 million. So one community to receive full extension of fiber eats up a fifth of that money in no time. So it's a daunting task, but and 50 million is better than nothing. But I think it's still very much just a tiny drop in the bucket in terms of what rural New Hampshire needs, given the sheer number of road miles we have that are unserved or underserved.
Yeah, that is true. Do we have any more questions?
We do. So the next question is coming to us live from Facebook. And it says, "Thank you both for all you have tried. So what can we do now?"
And Barbara talked often about this as an area, living in an area that's unserved. So all I can say, Barbara, is, boy, we need a groundswell of support from rural New Hampshire. I mean, every single resident who feels unserved or underserved needs to start writing the governor. And you need to connect with your local legislators, and you also need to connect with our congresswomen and our senators. They need to know, they need to hear from hundreds, thousands of New Hampshire residents that are frustrated in a really coordinated grassroots campaign. I think if ever there were a need for a campaign to coordinate this on a statewide level for rural New Hampshire, this would be the time to speak with many, many voices chiming in.
I agree. I completely agree. And I mean, I don't want to sound self-serving, but you do need to elect someone to the Senate seat who's going to put that at the top of her priority list, and who's going to be committed to talking to the communities and organizing that kind of groundswell and using it to push for real change from the legislature. I mean, I think that it's going to have to be a coordinated effort, and it's going to be an effort that is well represented in the legislature so that it moves forward there, because eventually it is there that the legal battle is going to be taking place.
Wonderful. And we actually have a quick follow-up as well from the same person asking about dark fiber. What is dark fiber?
So dark fiber, and Barbara, you have it running on Route 10 right by your house. Dark fiber is fiber that's on the poles. The New Hampshire Fast Roads backbone is on the poles, but it's not being used to provide service. So in New Hampshire, there are hundreds of miles of dark fiber residing on poles that internet service providers or telecom companies have installed for some future use, but that fiber isn't lit, meaning it's not providing service. It has the capability, but it's just not providing service. So figuring out where there's fiber currently available that needs to be lit is part of what needs to happen. And then obviously, very often that dark fiber is on major state routes and major rural roads, but doesn't connect off those major roads on side roads and side streets. And so the next issue is, how do you then connect offshoots from that fiber network to what we call the last mile, which is all the homes on your street and all through Lyme and all through Charlestown and all through Cornish and Plainfield. Lots of last mile that isn't served at all.
Julia, do you want to talk a little about poles? Because poles are an issue. What happens if a municipality wants to just lay a fiber, and there are already private companies that have that dark fiber on the poles? How does that work out?
So take the Lime Fiber project as an example, Beatriz. Your community had to go through a long process of doing a poll study in Lime. Every single poll had to be reviewed, cataloged. They had to determine what was on that poll, and then they had to begin to negotiate with the poll owner, which in most of your polls in Lime are owned by Consolidated, and the electric utility to make room on that pole for your fiber. If there's already dark fiber or private fiber on those poles, you then have to negotiate with the fiber tenant that's already there to make room for additional fiber. And let me tell you, those folks can be really difficult to deal with. They don't want the competition. They may not be providing service. It may be dark fiber, but they don't want you on that pole because you may push them to have to offer service before they're ready to. So getting onto a pole is a long, cumbersome, and expensive process. More than half the cost of connecting people with fiber are what are called the pole make ready costs. Getting the pole ready for the attachment of the new fiber.
That's why I asked you the question, because I remember as a freshman in the Committee on Science, Technology, and Energy, the day we had our training session on poles. I had never thought about poles, honestly. And then I realized just how complex the issue was and how much hung on those poles when you were thinking about doing something like deploying broadband. It's one of the key issues that have to be taken into account in any project like that.
And it's what takes most of the time. It's getting the poles, it's negotiating for space on the poles, and then getting the space provided for you on the poles. That takes time. The electric utility has to get out to do a lot of work. The telephone utility has to get out to do a lot of work. Any other pole attaches. That's why when I say a typical project takes 18 to 24 months, the lion's share of the time is in getting the poles ready to have the fiber attached to the poles.
That's great.
I never, as a local official, I think of the legislators who, when you all have to become subject matter experts in hundreds of fields to be able to sort of assess all these bills, and when you're dealing with things like broadband deployment and pole attachments, and I don't know, Beatriz, I have huge respect for what our elected officials do, because I know how much time I have to spend just trying to manage the issues I've got on my plate, much less the many other issues that come to you as a senator or a representative.
Well, we've got another question. I was actually about to ask a question about who owns the poles, but Julie, you just answered that perfectly. We'll go on instead to this question that we got from YouTube. How has COVID-19 aggravated the lack of internet access?
Oh, and poor Beatriz, we've lost her due to the lack of high-speed internet.
That's probably what happened. I'm sure she'll be back any second.
I know. It's really aggravated the situation significantly. The combination of parents and working professionals being shifted to working virtually at home, particularly trying to work over, video platforms like Zoom, for example, or Microsoft Teams, or GoToMeeting. Has been really difficult. And in addition, so many families have kids who've been trying to study from home, also using the video platforms. And for many residents of this part of the state, it has been a mind-numbingly frustrating experience for them, because they just can't do their jobs. Their kids can't study. It's been really, really difficult. And that is really sort of brought back to the top of I think the priority list for those of us at the local level the really critical need for us to wade in here and get this done, because people desperately need it just to function at a basic professional and schooling level.
Well, the other thing is that the spaces that they used to go to in order to have, access to high-speed internet during the regular school year have been closed down. I mean, they used to go to the libraries. They used to go to public spaces where they could have access to internet if they didn't have it at home. And those have not been available. So that also aggravates the situation.
Yeah. That's why I think, there's real potential for the legislature in New Hampshire to step up, particularly if they start hearing from a large number of constituents that the need is critical. Here's an opportunity to kind of make a difference in people's lives. And if the state got behind this in a really big way, it would make a difference.
Well, I think all that needs to happen. And I think that this is the best chance we've had to make it happen since we got started with that fight to expand broadband to everyone. I really think so.
Okay, the next question is about polls again, and it comes to us from YouTube. Oh, it's a different question than I thought it was. Sorry. It's, can you tell us anything about what the newly formed Grafton County Broadband Committee's role is?
So the Grafton County Broadband Committee is a committee that's really started as a result of the COVID pandemic, given the sheer number of communities in Grafton County and Coos County, as well as Cheshire and Sullivan, that are unserved or underserved, woefully underserved. And so the Grafton County Committee formed to begin to talk in a sort of comprehensive rural county way about what might be possible for the county to spearhead the rollout of high-speed internet. And, it's great if you can get county involvement, because this is going to take an all-hands-on-deck, multi-community effort to get the attention of our legislature, our governor, and our federal delegation. And this is the first time the county's really stepped up in this role, which is wonderful to see happen, because it tells me that they're really seeing a need in a way that they didn't feel was worth their time and effort earlier.
Talking about connectivity, I don't know if you noticed that I disappeared twice. It was not, I didn't do it on purpose. I wasn't trying to make a point, but it just goes to show how frail and how unpredictable our connections are. Today is a perfect day. We don't have a storm. We don't have high winds. We don't have anything that would justify that. But you can be in the middle of the most important meeting or activity, and your internet just drops.
Yeah.
I swear that I didn't rig it. It just happened. It just happened on its own, and it's not the first time, and it will not be the last.
That state of affairs.
Yeah, I know.
Well, we have another question. We have more questions. We've got a very lively chat here. We have the other question from the other user from YouTube. Is using poles the only way to deploy fiber, or for that matter, any type of connection?
So no, poles are not the only way. Certainly going underground is another way, but going underground, believe it or not, is more expensive. And in cold, snowy, frost-heavy New Hampshire, it can be, and granite, the granite state, essentially going underground with fiber along hundreds of miles of rural roadways can also be challenging just in terms of the topography. That being said, one of the things that I remember pushing and in fact talking about this with the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee when Beatriz served in the House and on that committee was that one role municipalities could play would be for us as a municipal entity to dig the trench with our municipal crews to bury the conduit so that fiber could be run in that conduit along our rights of way. And I'm still convinced that if municipalities could purchase the equipment and staff that function and get that fiber buried, it would be a whole lot faster than the 18 to 24 months it takes to get poles ready to attach to. So that's another way in which I think municipal entry into this space could be very meaningful, is for us to do that trenching work. And conduit is conduit. The internet service provider specs the kind of conduit they want their fiber running through, and we just dig the trench for them. We dig trenches all the time.
That's right. I mean, the use of conduits, like in Lime, for instance, the Lime fiber builds the backbone, but then it's up to the individual owner to pay for the conduit that will take the fiber from the pole to the house.
Right.
So it's work that all municipalities are used to do, and it's work that works very well here, where you have snowstorms and wind and fallen trees and all those things. So it can be a very actually safe way to lay out the fiber. But it is costly, and it requires an initial investment. And the only way the municipality can make that initial investment is if they have the ability to bond to build broadband infrastructure. So
Right.
it takes us back to the same financing problem.
Right.
Okay. So we have still more questions, but I see that we're running a little bit low on time. So let me sneak this one in now, and we'll see where we are and maybe answer some over email. So the last question comes from our YouTube audience again, and it's, Julia, are the Wi-Fi services viable in the future?
Yes, very much so. And they're only getting better. Wi-Fi technology and opportunities for mounting Wi-Fi in locations to essentially extend the coverage is only getting better. I would still argue that first and foremost, you need a fiber backbone with amplification using Wi-Fi. To assume that we can connect the state with just Wi-Fi, I think is probably not accurate. So I happen to believe, and I've been a believer in a long time, and again, I said this time and time again to Beatriz as we were dealing with the question of why fiber. Is fiber the technology we want to invest in? I happen to think fiber is here for the long haul. It's really stable, it's really robust, and it's relatively affordable. But Wi-Fi as an amplification for fiber is absolutely a viable option for many communities, particularly for that last 2 or 3 houses on a stretch of fiber where they may be quite far apart, but with a Wi-Fi bouncer, you could get to those houses, but you still need fiber extended much more significantly than we have now in New Hampshire.
I agree. I think that Wi-Fi is a good option for the last mile, but that the main backbone is much more robust and safe if it's fiber. Yeah.
Okay. Julia, do you have to run, or can we ask more?
I
okay.
do.
Maybe you have to. It's all right.
I'm so sorry, but I have to hop on a select board meeting now that starts in 5 minutes. So unfortunately, I have to unplug from this conversation and plug into another Zoom platform. My apologies.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Julia always has to run. She ran to this meeting, now she's running to the next one.
Beatriz, I look forward to continuing to work with you on this really important issue.
So, and you know what? This time we're going to make it happen. I mean, we're going to make it happen. You'll see. Thank you so much for coming and being with us. Thank you so much for, helping explain the complexities and also the possibilities of broadband expansion in our area, because I think that we're looking at a good opportunity, and I think we can get it through. And I'm certainly counting with your help to do that.
All right. Take care, all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
For Beatriz, if you have time, we have a question from YouTube. Why do you think broadband is so important besides telework, education, and telemedicine? Besides those 3 things, why is it so important?
Well, as I said, when I started working on broadband, the Republican contingent of the House, and at that point we had a Republican majority, thought that broadband was just for fun, that it was, for video streaming and so on. I knew that that was not the case. I knew that it was a key component for many more things. The pandemic has made that much more clear, and now everybody's aware of the fact that, for schooling, if kids have to go to school remote, for work, we have to do telework. For hospitals that were already, struggling financially before the pandemic and have lost a ton of money during the pandemic, it would imply using telemedicine. It could be very effective. It could bring the costs down. For healthcare access, people who did not have very good access to high quality healthcare could have it through telemedicine. So there is a whole array of areas of our daily life that require that tool, broadband access. There are other areas. I mean, at this point, you realize that most of the time you talk to your friends through, the internet. That family gatherings take place over the internet. That even happy hours take place over the internet. Well, that's your social life. So that broadband is not just important because children go to school and people need healthcare access, and because we all have to work from home at this point, or most of us. It's important because it's an essential part of our social fabric, and that is something that is not usually taken into account. Now it is because of the pandemic, and again, there lies the opportunity. But then there are other issues. You think about the economy of a particular area. You think about its ability to grow, to develop a thriving economy. That's not going to happen unless people have broadband. People are not going to be buying houses in areas that don't have broadband. Jobs are not going to grow in areas that don't have broadband because people cannot communicate easily with all the network that is tied to whatever job they're connected to. So, the ramifications of that tool are probably the largest that we can look at now for a single item. And that's why it has to be a top priority. And that's why I see it as a top priority. I did 10 years ago, but now I see it even more so. And that it has to be at the top of the agenda. There is no question about it.
Okay. Are those all the questions? I think they might be. So Beatriz, do you want to close it out for us?
Well, yes, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Julia's ghost because she's already left, but I thanked her while she was still here. It's been a pleasure, as always, to talk about broadband with her, as it has been to work with her on broadband for all these years. I hope that you found your questions answered in a satisfactory way. We certainly enjoyed getting the questions and such lively participation. Thank you very much to all of you. And don't despair, don't despair if you live far away from, a pole that has dark fiber that may become not so dark in the near future, because I think that help is on the way, and that this has become a priority, and that we are going to be moving forward in that area, and we're going to do that quickly. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. And if you have any other questions, you can always email us and we can answer through email. Bye-bye.